I'm in the Quaker meeting house here today in Newtown. Is this the area is Newtown, Joan? Is it?
Yes,
Yeah, Newtown.
yes, yeah.
And I've been kindly invited up here by Joan Johnson. And Joan is a long-time friend of mine, and we worked together on the history of the famine in Waterford. And that's how we got acquainted. And so I've always wanted to sit down with Joan and ask her about her community, which are the Quakers in Waterford. Because I know when I was young, there was two types of religious people in Waterford. There was Catholics and Protestants. Little did I know that there was a treasure trove of other Christian communities within the city that I knew nothing about. And it's only when I got involved in looking at the famine period that I realised, and I say it most sincerely, Joan, that without the Quakers, we would have, to use a good old Waterford expression, we would have been banjaxed here in Waterford for what you did, not only in the city with the soup kitchens, but also up in Ring, which has been commemorated in a beautiful plaque up there. And so if you could please, Joan, explain to me, what is a Quaker and who are the Quakers?
Well, thank you, Dermot, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you. And it's appropriate that we are actually sitting in the Quaker meeting house. And every Sunday in this room, we have a meeting for worship. So the Quakers are a Christian religious group. They're called the Religious Society of Friends in Ireland, in London, in all over the world. But we're a small religious group, Christian, based on Christianity. So we're a small, within the compass of we used to be in the Protestant church, but we actually, our founder, George Fox, in the 1600s, during the civil turmoil in the 1600s in England, started to question the actual ethos of the Christian practices in the Episcopalian Church, the Church of England. And he saw there practices that he felt weren't Christian or Christian-based. And he wanted to get back to basics, to get the actual story that Jesus spoke about when he was on this earth. And he felt that there were layers and layers had gone since that time on to that basic belief of love your neighbour and look for the good in people. That institutionalized church had evolved, and he wanted to peel those layers off and get back to what he felt were the strongly held beliefs of him, which were truth, honesty, equality, trust, and religious tolerance. So he spoke out when he was in England, and he became very unpopular with the authorities and his followers, and they were clapped into jail or they were persecuted. And at various stages they felt they had to move away, and some fled to America, and William Penn is another story, and his followers there, and some came to Ireland. But the tenets of our religion is to come to meeting on a Sunday. And you'll see here, it's a round circular room. We sit in silence and we wait. We wait for the divine presence within us. And that is that is fundamental. We feel that there's God in everybody. And we wait in the silence, in a worshipful way. Everybody is equal. There's no clergy. And so everybody is entitled, man, woman, or child, to participate in this meeting for worship. And it lasts about an hour. And it can get it's more than meditation, but it's on the road to that, as it were. And so the silence can be very deep, and therefore everybody can have their own journey, as it were. And there's a great freedom within the meeting for worship. and it can be very profound. And then people are welcome to get up and give their comments, their feelings at the time about a certain aspect of their spiritual journey. And often then that's a thread through the meeting for about an hour. So that is basically it. So it's such a quiet space, and it engenders a wonderful feeling of calmness and nourishment.
And you know, Joan, it's interesting you say that about the quietness, because when you find that in Jesus' life as reflected in the Gospels, the two most important periods of his life was when he went into the desert,
yes.
when he was commencing his ministry,
yes.
and spent 40 days and 40 nights. And the final night of his life, he spent in a garden on his own praying. So that's exactly reflected, like your beliefs reflected exactly in the Gospels.
The other point for people to understand is George Fox and his followers stripped away all the rituals. Every day was equal. So Sunday wasn't every day. Every day was a sacrament. But we don't have any sacraments as such. So there's no baptism as an act of official church workings, as it were. And there's no communion. So he felt those were all impediments to the fundamental Christian belief of feeling this spirituality, that all these had really stopped the way of the ordinary people, and the church and its institutions were an impediment to this.
Well, I mean, the history of the church has proved that, because there's so many people arguing, fighting and killing each other over whether Jesus is really in the sacraments, or people have been burdened. We have Bloody Mary and Protestant Reformation and all that. It's so what you're saying is exactly.
So it's very relevant to today as it was, say, in the 1650s, as it were. So basically, it's a very democratic society too. Everybody is equal. Women as well partake. So we don't have any priests, but we do have to have a structure to work our society. And we have elders who are a group of people who would take care of the spiritual side of the meeting and how it's progressing. Then we have ministers of oversight. If people are in trouble or need guidance, or maybe somebody had died, they would go and visit and they would attend to that particular thing. Then there's business organization and the relief of the poor. So there's a whole lot of committees, and everybody is expected to take their part in that. We have also care of the children, and here we have the meeting, but in another room on a Sunday, the children's meeting is there, and they're taken to course for an hour in like a Sunday school, and then they come in and join, and the children just accept this silence, and they sit with their parents, and they're part, and a very important part of the meeting. So that's Sundays, and those are the tenets: simplicity, honesty, equality, and religious tolerance, and of course pacifism. They abhor a war, absolutely, all through the ages they have, and you will have had active pacifism emerging from individuals and the society. And for example, in the First World War, they wouldn't fight, but they would go. They set up, say, an ambulance service, and they would go to the front, and the Quakers would give relief that way. Second World War as well. They did huge work in refugees, and I could speak forever as regards their work in the refugees. Now, the Quakers, I actually wasn't born a Quaker. I married into an old Irish Quaker family called Bewley. And so I was born into a Methodist background. But it wasn't until I met my husband, Roger, and he was steeped in Quakerism. So I said, well, if you can't beat him, join him. And we came down here, and Roger was teaching at Newtown, and there was this community, and it seemed very natural. So I joined, and people can join. You come, and we've had quite a number. It's quite interesting now. I think there's been a disillusionment in certain circles in Ireland, but people are still looking for a spirituality, a grounding. And here we have an open public meeting for worship. Anybody is welcome to come. And it's not intrusive, that you could come in, sit and go away. People, they're very sensitive, the Quakers, I found, and they don't proselytize. Therefore, they're under the radar, as it were. They work away, they do their good works, and I suppose because I wasn't a Quaker at the beginning, I have a certain feeling that I can observe their workings, and it is very empathetic, but as I say, very quietly done. And their work practices, for example, you mentioned the Famine, they would have worked quietly away with every religion and none. They worked with the priests and the Church of Ireland here, and people who were on the relief committees, but nothing really. They wouldn't have blown their actions up at all. And the book, which was a record, which is the Bible really on what the Quakers did, is a 32 county record of all the works that happened during the famine. And you'll find there that, and there's an index. Now that book was out of print in 1996, and you'll remember we collaborated on the famine in Waterford.
Yes.
And that was my first excursion into writing at that stage. But I went looking for the records, and I knew that they had published this report, but when I went to look in our library, there was one copy left. So in 1996, I said, this isn't good enough. And I said, I knew there was a national commemoration committee, and I went to Alfred Doyle and I said, look, can you fund us to get this book out again with an index? So in there, you can look and see what's happened in Waterford. They brought their boilers in. 32 boilers were brought into Waterford, and they were sent out to counties and right down to Ring and up to Aglish and the Nor Valley, and so they didn't do that all on their own. They got them in, and then they made arrangements for them to go, and they fed through that, and that, as I say, I can only touch on that particular aspect at the moment.
For Waterford people, you could probably tell me of more locations, but I do know that the Fanning House, which is now the President Tax Office in the Glen, that used to be the House of Industry.
Yes.
And so the Quakers had a soup kitchen there. Yeah. They also had one down what was called the Fish House. Yeah. That approximates where the clock tower is now. That was another soup kitchen there that the Quakers. But their contribution to Waterford, when I became aware of first, when we were working on that Famine book, it's mind-boggling. Mm-hmm. And I have a great friend up in Ring, Nicholas Greaves. And when I was up in Nicholas, and he brought me down to Ballinagowell and showed me the memorial down there to the memory of the Quakers' contribution. I mean, they saved Ring. Mm-hmm. But even before that, Joan, you go back into the Waterford newspapers and you will see it's the Quakers and the Protestants were responsible for encouraging Father Matthew on his temperance crusade in the 1830s. Similarly, in the 1820s, they were instrumental in starting the Mendicity Asylum, which was down in Railway Square, as we know it. But Edmund Rice shared the treasurership with Protestants, with Quakers. That wouldn't have happened in the 20th century.
No, that's interesting.
It was a magical time, and it really was, and a time that needs to be, written about.
Yes.
But so for me, through that I became, and I was gobsmacked at the contribution that the Quakers had made, but unacknowledged. And that's what I wanted so much to speak to you, Joan, is to get that out, the contribution, and I still feel it's just so important that the contribution, particularly of the Quakers, and to the mercantile life of the city. Now, Joan, why did the Quakers come to Waterford, and in what year?
Well, they came around 1655, and why? Many of them came as refugees with hardly anything in their possession, because they were being hunted out, really, by the authorities. They were looked as traitors. They spoke up. For example, George Fox, say he was in his own church, he would stand up and he would disagree with the minister giving his sermon, and he would question certain particular ethics or practices. And not only was he looked upon as being anti-church, but he was anti the throne. And so that was, and so George Fox was clapped into jail many times, and other leaders, and the families, and a lot, some of them stayed, but others got weary, and they wanted a new life. And they came to Waterford. And Dermot, they settled around the Wise Park area, Manor Street, Bowling Lane, Bowling Alley Lane. And they came with nothing, but they were hardworking, honest, and they formed a small community down that area. And they became known as being honest. For example, they would be small farmers, and they bring in, say, their vegetables into the market. And if somebody was buying a pound or a stone of potatoes, they'd know that the Quakers were giving them a stone of potatoes and not anything less. And they became known for their honesty. And within 1655, and within 2 generations, they were moved from Wise Park down to O'Connell Street. They jumped through a meeting house in Bowling Alley down there to 1791, okay? The big meeting house was built.
Yeah.
Now, how did they afford that? Because they'd been successful in business. And so they moved then their houses and their shops. So along O'Connell Street and down to the brewery and along the quays, they set up small shops. And that is what they did. Now, the interesting other thing is that they had their meeting house, but they hadn't got a burial ground. And they weren't allowed bury their dead in the church burial ground. So they had to get their own. So they set up one in John's Lane, and that has about 200 in it. And there's a nice memorial there, as you know, to them. But they had been forgotten. And you have all the who's who of the Quakers.
Very much so.
The Strangmans, the Jacobs, the Penroses, Courtneys, Cherries in that first graveyard. And then across into what's known as Wise Park, they had to have another one, and there's 400 in there. And that's when we first met, Dermot, because you drew my attention to, and I knew nothing about this. I think this must have been in the 80s when we met, and you showed me the map. And I have it here today to remind me of the 400 that are buried there. And there you have the 19th century Quaker merchants.
Well, the cream of the mercantile class of Waterford City. The cream, you know.
And certainly there is a growing interest of the Quaker heritage in Waterford, but it's taken quite a long time. For example, like yourself. Now, I have to mention that the Waterford City Council last year have published the Quaker Trail. Now, that's this particular, I don't know whether you've seen it or not.
Yes.
Yeah. And they asked me to do the text for that, which sort of got me going again as regards the Quaker heritage in the 18th, 19th century. And so it refreshed my memory of the merchant classes. And there's a list there of about 20 who were into butter making, corn merchants. The glass, I mean, is legendary. I still wish that the two Penroses, William and George, uncle and nephew, they are buried, forgotten really, in the graveyard in it was called the Parliament Street graveyard. There, and I would hope sometime the city fathers would take it upon themselves to mark that in some appropriate way. But all of those families moved into O'Connell Street. Now, the one thing I think, because the businesses grew, they intermarried. One of the things about the Quakers at that stage, they were internalized in their community, as it were. They focused on their hard work and their families, and they intermarried. And they had big families. For example, the Jacob family that later went on to become the Jacob's Biscuits, they lived in O'Connell Street. And they had, I think they had 13 or 14 children. Those were big families. That family came down to the Biscuits. There was some in banking, which was the Penny Bank, Waterford Penny Bank. And then there was the builders. Thomas White Jacob was a builder. He was on 46 the Quays, and he started off as a hardware shop and went into plumbing, and then it went into building, and he built, as I understand, and more research has to be done on this, but at the back of O'Connell Street up to Ballybricken, those houses that are in lovely terraces, I understand he built some of them. He built some of the houses here, for example, the one at the top of Newtown called Rock Village.
Yes, the big one, yes.
Yeah, that was his as well, Thomas White Jacob. But they weren't just merchants. They had this social practice of helping the poor, and more has to be done about that. But you get a glimpse of it. You saw it in the famine. Now, they formed a committee, a relief committee here in Waterford. Joshua William Strangman. The Strangmans were brewers. He was a single man and was working in the brewery. He had time to then focus on the famine. Horrendous reports that he gives of his local situation here, which would filter up to the main committee in Dublin and then over to London. There was a network, and he really is responsible. And that plaque down in Ring is commemorating the work that he did. But he did other work, as for example, he was on the Famine Institute. He also was in banking, so he had his fingers in many pies, but they were all grounded. They never really put their money into big houses and plush clothing, and they poured their money back into the companies to let them grow. And Penroses married Nevins, and they married Strangmans, and so it filtered out. So you had this then big meeting house in O'Connell Street, which all these big merchants would drive to their meeting from Clonmel, Portlawn. The Malcolmsons were there as well.
It's now the Garter Lane
Yes.
Theatre, just
Yes.
for people who want to see what it was like.
Yes.
And it's still the original
Yes.
building. It hasn't been worked on very much.
No,
except inside.
The main bit. I mean, I came in 1965, and that was where the Waterford Quakers worshipped. By that stage, the numbers in Waterford had decreased, but the main buildings, the theatre, was a huge big room where in the 18th and 19th century the Quakers of Munster would meet and would all meet, and that would be full. There was a gallery and everything around it, and it would be a 3-day event where they would meet and socialise and also do their business affairs. And then the room on the left was where I remember we would have had our meeting for worship on a Sunday. And we're thrilled that now that building became, it was too big for us at that stage. So the city council bought the building eventually. It was a courthouse, a temporary courthouse at one stage before that. And we're delighted to see that it is being used as a creative space. And we then moved here in the late 70s.
There was, Joan, I was looking at something about the famine, and you probably heard that saying that God gave us the blight, but the English gave us the famine. Of course, England is always attributed to being the cause of it. However, I discovered something, and I don't think it was in your book on the transactions of the Society of Friends. It was in the relief reports, parliamentary reports, and probably many people would not be aware of it. Perhaps you're aware of it, and that is, you could see the contributions that were made in England towards the famine in Ireland, right? Mm-hmm. And you look at names, Halifax, areas around Manchester, mostly weaving little villages, all that grew into larger cities later on. But all the names you see of the people who sent the money, Jacobs, Pims, all Quaker names. And I said to a friend of mine, wouldn't it be lovely to go back to these little towns and villages with a band and say, play a bit of Irish music and say, thanks. Instead of, like, it's absolutely, it's amazing. When I saw it and I saw the names, I instantly recognised the names as being Quaker names. Yes. And they were collecting those from shopkeepers, from factories, from weaving factories. It's just, I must give you a list of some of those names. It's fascinating. Fascinating.
Well, you see, one of the strengths of being a small community is that, especially during that time, there was, and still is, collaboration between the different countries. Now, we were all the one at that stage. It was British Empire and British Isles, as it were. And so what was being said, and I'll give you an example of this. A lot of people and the newspapers were saying there's no famine in Ireland, no famine in Ireland. And the Quakers went out, they travelled around, and a fellow called James H. Duke, Yorkshireman, came over. He was a banker, and there was about 4 of them who travelled to Connaught, which was one of the worst places. And he sent a report back, and he reported to the Quakers in England and here, and it was horrendous. And he sent also letters to the papers. And so at that, it's an example of the education that these Quakers had and the realization that they could influence through word and reports. And so he got the Quakers going, and others here, of course, such as Strangman, and they formed this Central Relief Committee. And they had organisation skills, you see, through their businesses and everything. And they set up committees in Waterford and Cork and Limerick and the West, and they all worked together. And if they were getting help, especially from America, I mean, there's the American stories in there. You were talking about the people who were subscribing from the UK, but the Americans, the Quakers wrote to the Americans, and there were Jacobs over there and Harveys, and they then got going over there, and it was through the Quakers that the American money came. And why? Because the Quakers were trusted with the money, so that they knew when the money came or the grain came, it would be distributed. But there's a whole night in the famine. But what I wanted to say was that when the famine receded, there was huge poverty, as you well know here, in housing and health, the TB, and so on. So the Quakers kept going with their relief committee here, as it were, and they worked quietly. And I haven't done enough research, but they had a relief committee here, the Waterford Relief Committee, and we have the names. And every year I have a list of who subscribed to that particular relief committee. And again, the names are there: the Jacobs, the Strangmans, the Peats, the Courtneys, the Bells, the Chapmans.
God,
they're all there, and they were contributing maybe somewhere £3 a year. Now that was quite a bit of money during that time, and that committee went on to about the 1940s. And what did they do? Well, one of the things they did was there was an Albert Bell from Bell's on the Quays. They were a big shop there, very near the Grand Club.
And a big bell outside it.
That's right.
I remember it well.
Yes. Well, Albert was working in that, and he set up 4 poorhouse hostels for men. They were called the Tusker lodging houses, and these were to give a clean bed, some food at a very reasonable rate. And those houses are dotted around in Waterford. And during my work on the Quaker Trail, I at least identified one, which was in O'Connell Street, and it used to be Hills. They had a grocery shop on the corner opposite
Grubbs.
Or
Charles
White's.
James Hill.
Yes.
Yeah.
That house was one of the hostels for men.
Okay.
And there was another one in Henrietta Street as well, and 2 others I just can't remember. But you're talking sort of something like 19,000 bed nights a year in that area. There was also, they set up a women's one up in Ballybrick, and I still have to find that one out as well. So they did these shelters for men. And that was one thing. And then there's a story of Anna and Frederick Bell, and they started the Munster Dining Room. And that is in where Dunn's Stores is, just in Michael Street, as you're turning towards Michael Street, where Monsoon shop was years ago.
Yeah.
And they had a 2-tier system. In the bottom, Anna, there was a kitchen, and you could go in there, and people who were very poor were given a pint of soup and a half a loaf of bread for a penny. You could bring your own can, and you get 2 pints, and you could bring away. It was the first takeaway, I reckon, in Waterford. You could bring your pint and bring 2 pints on off for a penny without the bread. And to subsidise that, they had a fancy restaurant on top. So you went up the steps, and you go in on the right was the soup kitchen, really.
Yeah.
And upstairs was the fancy dining room where the business people with their white tablecloths and everything were served a meal, and they would be charged, and they would then be subsidising the meal below. And that was Annabelle, brother Frederick, and his other brother Albert. They were the 3 of them there doing a huge amount of work.
Well, what you're telling me here, Joan, is that it is the reason that I wanted to sit down and talk to you, because you told me before about the Tusker Lodging House and that, but to the extent you've told me, I mean, I'm very well aware, and sometimes I'm very saddened, or sometimes I get very angry, at the poverty that was in Ireland and in Waterford, and a lot of unnecessary poverty, bad housing, exploitative type of housing that was on. And yet we have a community in Waterford. We're doing so much that we're largely forgotten. It's just an unbelievable story, and such an important story to have remembered, and the community here. I mean, as I said at the beginning, only for the Quakers. Look at all the stuff you're telling me now. Like I'm gobsmacked at the amount of charity that these people did for the poor people of Waterford. And by God, was there a lot of poor people. And in the area you spoke about, Ballybricken, Corrigeen, just off of Patrick Street there, you had little lanes there that were described as worse than anything in Dublin. And again, it's the Quakers came along to the rescue.
Well, they did their bit. I'm sure there were others that were doing it, but the women also visited into the poor houses, and this relief committee, they would give the women would go and say they wouldn't just give out the tickets, but they had these little tickets or vouchers, and so if they went in, like the Vincent de Paul do now, would go in and they wouldn't give money, but they give a voucher, and that voucher would entitle them to maybe a bag of coal or to go down to the Munster dining room and get food for a week, their soup or something to augment what they had. And of course, Dr. Mary Strangman, who became a city councillor, she was very aware of the bad health and campaigned
brilliant woman
for improvement in that area, as did Sarah Holmes White, as did Rosamund Jacob, a nationalist Irish speaker, and wrote that fabulous book, A History of the United Irishman and the Rebel's Wife. I have a copy of that, Dermot, and if you ever wanted, I learned more about Wolfe Tone, on that in her book, and she's been forgotten. She has. And she was part of the Jacob family.
So anybody ever going into the Grandfather's Hotel on the Quay and look at the plaque of Thomas Francis Marr, it's Rosamund Jacob was responsible for that. She came down at the opening and gave a very spirited speech.
Did she?
Oh, she did indeed. A very spirited Republican speech. At the opening of that, she was the main speaker at it.
Really?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear.
I'll give you the clipping out of the newspaper.
I would, because they gave the Civic Trust put up a blue plaque for Rosamund there a few years ago, and also to Mary Strangman as well. And another one that, and Anna Bell should get one. But I mean, the Quakers don't look for any accolades. But the pacifism is a thread that goes right through. Right. And a little known fact is that the Quakers received the Nobel Prize, and I'm entitled to vote for a Nobel. One of the things is that the Quakers can actually vote or nominate somebody to this day for an award for the Nobel Prize. In 1949, it was after the Second World War, and the Quakers were deep in relief work during the Second World War. They had their ambulance units going everywhere. The refugee was like underground railway, getting the children and some Jewish families out as well. They had put down roots, you see, from the First World War, and had helped in the famine times after that. And Doris White, who lived only down the road, a single lady from the White family, she went out in the First World War and was in Moscow doing relief work there. And she came back to Waterford for a trip back in the 1936, and she wasn't allowed back to work in Moscow again. Her visa was cancelled, and she was so disappointed. She never recovered. She became a recluse, and I'd love to do more work on her and what she's buried down in the burial ground, as is Mary Strangman and all the Jacobs. And sometime we might go down there.
Oh, it's a must, yeah. We definitely will,
Yes.
and go to both of them. We'll go to the Wise Park one and the one you speak of. Yeah, we'll have to.
Otherwise, I suppose after the Second World War, the refugees came, and some of them are buried in. They became part, or at least the Waterford Quakers helped some of them individually, and they became part of this community, and they're buried, a lot of them, and not a lot of them, but some of them in the Newtown burial ground. But of course, quite a lot came to Newtown School. Arnold Marsh was the headmaster from about 1926. And Newtown School started in 1798. And again, the Quakers were very keen on education. They homeschooled to start with in their own houses. Say, if you could imagine down around the Cork Road, there were little houses there. And George Fox wanted education top of the pile, really, for both girls and boys. So they had no schools here, but they set up their own. And then eventually in 1798, that's, less than 150 years, they decided they wanted their own school for the province of Munster.
Do we speak of Newtown School, is it?
Yes. And that school was established. It was to go to Clonmel, and there's a story that they were all set to buy some land in Clonmel, and news came that the Newtown 17 acres around here, which we are on the side of here in the meeting house, was for sale. And the next day, after their meeting in Clonmel, so a few of the Quakers were dispatched down to look at it, and it was the quickest decision that was ever made by the Quakers, because Quakers can take quite a long time to make decisions. And they bought this from the Wise estate, and 17 acres. And it is still practically all intact, except they sold some land up on the edge of the Newtown Road here in order to fund building. And so you have some nice houses going up on the right.
Oh, so it's from the Wise estate. That's very interesting now, because
yes.
I thought I didn't think the Wise estate came out this far, but obviously it did.
Well, it was part of some
it was St. John's Prairie.
Yeah.
St. John's Prairie, but I'd like to see maybe perhaps if I could find an old Irish name, because it had to reflect some way back to the Prairie of St. John, which, as you know, stands down in Wise Park.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Sir Thomas Wise is reputed to have been born.
Oh, up there, yeah.
There's a plaque on the side of the main building up there that he was born there. And if you go into the Museum of Treasures, you'll see some photographs of and there's one particular one which I reckon was taken of the Wise family. It's a painting, but it's from internally in one of the rooms. I'll show it to you when we go up, and I reckon it was the family living there, because I can identify some of the windows and the structure around it. So the Wises were selling, and so in 1798 it was opened with 36 children, boys and girls. And it was also a working farm at that stage as well. So the pupils were educated, but they were expected to also partake in...
So it was self-sufficient?
Yeah, well, they were trying to. Oh, yes, and when I came in 1965, there was absolute gorgeous garden, a vegetable garden there. And all the vegetables were grown there, and then went to the kitchens. They would be the thread of simplicity and sustainability and simple living is a thread that still goes on to today. And I suppose the perception of Newtown amongst Waterford people has a certain aspect of maybe exclusivity, you know.
There was that perception.
Yeah.
There was.
Yes.
I don't think anymore.
No, not now, but certainly, well, you see, it was a private school. They couldn't do anything else because everything else was being ruled by the Catholics, the Catholic Church, and so they were independent. But in order to do that, the people had to pay fees, and it grew into this private school, which really the Quakers didn't want it to function, to become an exclusive school. And so it was, I think, 2007 or around, say, 10 or 12 years ago, I can't remember, the school became part of the national education system here, which we were very pleased about, which means that people can go to school there and pay no fees. Excellent. Now, except the boarding, the government don't pay for the boarding, so people who want to board.
What, Joan, of the Quaker community today? Is your community increasing, or has it remained static, or do you have new members joining?
Yes.
You know.
Good question. Good question. I suppose, looking back over 200 years, they were at the height of their membership. They would never have been big, because it's quite hard to be a Quaker. It really is. It's a do-it-yourself kind of religion, and so you have to be of a certain way to want to be independent and to work it out yourself and not be told of the dogma from as others are. So it would never appeal to everybody. So it would always be small everywhere, all over the world. But in Ireland, if you look at Ireland, one of the biggest tragedies was around the late early 1800s. The Quakers really got very strict on themselves, and they wouldn't allow their young ones to marry out. Do you understand?
I understand, just other denominations,
yes.
Yeah.
And that was the demise of the membership, because what did the young people do? They walked with their feet, and they left. And they left and they married. Now, often they'd marry Church of Ireland, and you'll find actually quite a connection with the burial ground here and the one up in John's Hill there, the Church of Ireland one. You'll see Quaker names buried there because they married. But the elders in the early 1810s and before that, they just were so strict and they wouldn't budge. It was called the quietest time, when they just internalized and wanted to make the rules so that they would keep the membership pure, I suppose. I don't know. But anyway, the membership dropped. Okay. And really it became, I would think there's about 3,000 members of the Quakers in the whole of Ireland. We here, I think, have maybe 150. That would include regular members. Here in meeting, for example, on a Sunday, we would have maybe anything between 20 and 40 here. Then the children will come in, and also some Newtown pupils will come in as well. So we could have maybe 60 here on a Sunday. It's very vibrant. And also, we are, as I said earlier, seeing an interest. People are joining, not in big numbers, but young families who want a framework to bring up their children in. And we've had an increase in membership.
Well, I'll give you a laugh now, because I was talking to a friend of mine and I was excited about the fact that I was going to speak to you about the Quakers, and he surprised me by saying, you know, he said, Dermot, he said, it's the one, he said, denomination that he said that I would readily join.
Yeah.
Now, like myself, he's into music.
Yeah.
So music gets in the way of everything, Joan, unfortunately. You know what I mean? It takes precedence over your whole life. But he said that to me, and I never heard him speaking about the Quakers before. Yeah. But he said to me, he said, that is one denomination, he said, that I would readily join, he said.
Yeah. Well, I must say, it is, for some people, it is very valuable. We had a gay wedding here recently, last year. Do you see?
Right.
The attitudes are very open.
Right.
You see.
So you didn't have any problem with that?
No. The procedures, we have procedures, and every month we have a business meeting which looks after the affairs. We have a clerk who takes that meeting. He serves us. He's not the leader of it, but he will do the business side of things. And so, for example, if somebody wants to get married, they can. We're recognised by the state as a place where a Quaker marriage is recognised by the state. Okay. So if two people wish to get married, then they come to the monthly meeting, which is every month, and they ask for permission to get married. And all the procedures, just like the priest, the Catholic Church has to do 3 months, you know, and all the organising of it, and then the meeting will have. And a Quaker wedding they marry themselves.
Oh, do they?
Yeah. Yes. Our daughter was married here. There were 150 people here, and she walked in with her husband-to-be together. There was none of this going up the aisle or anything, and everybody's sitting, and we sit down, and again, it's a meeting for worship, and in the middle of that, they get up and say their vows. They have vows to say, which are very simple, and then other people then contribute, and we can have music, you know. We can have music. We have had gorgeous music here. Often they're solos, or somebody might sing, and the same for funerals. You see. I was
going to ask you about funerals. Is there any particular way that a Quaker is buried or anything? Is it?
Yes. Well, again, it's a meeting for worship, but it's a public meeting for worship. Okay. So whoever is, whether he's a member, but if or not, some people are attenders. You know, you can come to the meeting and be an attender.
I understand.
Anyway, if it's a member, it'll be a meeting for worship here. And usually what happens, the people gather, the hearse comes in and is put into the middle of this circle and is surrounded. And then it's a meeting for worship, and people then there isn't a set service, but people will often have come prepared and maybe will read a passage or say a prayer or sing.
Okay. As again, like would the prayers be obviously they're scripture-based prayers? Would they be kind of reading like an extract from the Gospels or from the Bible?
Yes, it could be a passage from the Bible, or a psalm, like well-known psalm, or from a Quaker writer, or a poem. Something appropriate that would give empathy to the family and help in this time. Or it could be a memory, or it could be about the person. That's very acceptable too. And so that would again be quite emotional for people, and it's all done in silence. So some people would come in and they wouldn't have experienced that before, but they often say afterwards how pleasant and valuable they found this. And then the hearse is drawn out, and into the hearse the coffin is pulled out, and often it'll be down to the Newtown.
Yeah.
And people will just walk down. And then the coffin is brought to the site, and there's still the meeting here goes on to the place, and there's some time there for people to again contribute. And I was at one recently, and they've got quite big, and we had to have a microphone, and somebody sang the parting glass.
Oh, I know it.
You see, so music is part,
Yeah.
but not actually in the meeting for worship, except you could get up, Dermot.
I know, yeah.
And sing. I miss that part because the Methodists were great singers.
Yeah.
They were great on their hymns.
And actually, the song, I remember these, I don't know who said it here, the Protestants have all the best songs.
Oh, yeah.
It's very true, you know.
Yes, but I think the Catholics are starting to sing good now.
No, they're just stealing all the Protestant ones, Joan.
But to get back to the school, because I digress there, the school celebrated 200 years there in 1998. A lot happened all around that in the Famine books, and Maurice Wigham brought out this book. I don't know whether you have it.
I have it, yes.
And that is the Newtown School Waterford history, and that gives a very good history, and people can read it. But I think the school was run by Quakers, by a dedicated committee all through that time. And the curriculum was very early on was simple for boys and girls, and with the Quaker ethos there always, and still is.
Did it have a religious aspect to it, insofar as did you teach religion like it's taught, say, in a Catholic school or a Church of Ireland school? No.
It was by osmosis. Okay. There was no proselytizing. Yeah. But my husband, Roger, he went there. He went to school there from the age of, I think, 10 or 11. And he would say, no, there wouldn't be. There would be a religious, I think nowadays, there's a religious education, and they would talk about all different religions. But it really is, it's very hard to pinpoint the actual religious aspect of the Quaker religious aspect at Newtown. It's practiced rather than preached. So everybody there is an individual. There's and they try to get the best possible, whether it's a creative person, or and that could be artistic. I mean, we have had, and they would be encouraged in whatever gift they have. For example, music. Yeah. There is a good music department up there, and we have had good singers, including Sinead O'Connor, who we knew quite well when she was here, and the Boomtown. Some of the Boomtown Rats were at. My own brother Roy, he tells this story, and they would have had a band there on a Saturday night in the sort of 60s and 70s. They'd have a dance, and the school band would play. And my brother Roy tells the story that he was a drummer on the band, and he got sick, and who came in to take his place was Simon Crowe, who later went on to be the drummer in the Boomtown Rats. Okay. But Roy still plays the guitar, and so I suppose because we've been at school for so long, we can see the different people or know them. The Potters, for example, there would be a great creativity up there, and so you have, say, Stephen Pearce pottery down in Cork. You have the Moss pottery. They were all at school here. Oh. And then artists as well. And writers like Roy Foster. He was at school at Newtown. but those would be only people that we would remember, because
So everything, any sort of anything that you had that was blossoming,
Yeah.
they brought it to full bloom, so to
That's
speak.
right, it was
As
nourished.
opposed to a friend of mine, I met there a while ago, and he said to me, he said, Dermot, he said, my mother and father were lovely people. He said, they sent me to school to learn to talk. He said, but when I got there, I was told to shut up straight away. That was a difference. That was a difference in the schools I went to.
you would be encouraged to be nourished equally. And there's no school prizes at Newtown, for example. They don't have them at all. So you're not, just because you're academic and might be at another school and get the first prize, and that's the equality coming out, you see. Everybody's valued. And if you're not academic, then they try to find a way to help you through. And it's a community up there, boys and girls, and the teachers there. As I say, it's osmosis. There isn't. The practices have been there, laid down for so long. I mean, there'll be no corporal punishment or anything like that.
No corporal punishment.
Not at all. No, that would be the pacifism coming out and things, and the kids would be encouraged to do relief work and go out and fundraise for this or that and so on. And all our 5 children went there, and our 3 grandsons. Yeah.
Joan, you've told me an amazing story now of what and who the Quakers are. I know we're going to move on at a later stage, and we're going to visit the graveyards, and you're going to show us where the Penroses, the Waterford glass, and the Jacobs biscuits, and those and the whites, the ship merchants, and all that, where the bells hold on. So I'm looking forward to part 2, Joan, and thank you very much. And I thought we'd have this over in a half an hour, but I could sit here listening to you all night. So Joan, until part 2, Joan Johnson, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dermot. Thank you.